copy-edited, proofread, and indexed books for publishers, including the American Chemical Society, John Wiley, the Library of Congress, MIT Press, and Oxford University Press. The Harvard Lectures of Alfred North Whitehead is the most challenging project she's ever undertaken, and she will be talking to us today about indexing Whitehead.
Help me.
Yep, you're good, Joan. You're coming in just fine. You just need your
Click there. Click on share.
Okay, sorry.
that looks
Hello,
no, that looks
everyone.
good. That looks great, Joan. You're
Thank
coming
you.
through
Thank
just
you.
fine.
Not the Zoom expert here. I'm going to talk about what an index is, how an indexer works, what makes the Whitehead lecture notes especially challenging to index, and a few examples from the books. The Latin word index, which originally meant and currently means forefinger, is cognate with indicare, indicate. A book index points you to the location you're looking for in a book. The first attempt at a really thorough list of a book's contents was a Bible concordance produced by monks in France in the 13th century. Book indexes, as we know them, began to be added in the late 16th century. And in the mid-18th century, the word index took on the specific meaning of a list of topics in a book. Indexes became so popular that there was even a brief fad for indexing novels. An index is not a concordance, and a concordance is not a useful index. A concordance is a list of words with page numbers, whereas an index is a list of interrelated concepts with their page numbers. The concordance concept embodies Bertrand Russell's metaphysics of logical atomism, with each occurrence of a given word presented as an instance logically distinct from all the others. In contrast, a genuine index, properly developed, more closely embodies Whitehead's metaphysics of organic interrelatedness, with each term in the index requiring explication of its relationships to many of the other terms in the manuscript. In that sense, a concordance is simple-minded, as Whitehead said of Russell, whereas the idea of an index is vague and muddled, harder to capture the way concepts are, as Russell said of Whitehead. You can use an index in two ways. Before you read the book, you can see what's in the book and if the book contains the information you're looking for. After you read the book, you can look for the information you've read. People think indexing must be easy to automate and that a machine could do it, but in fact, only a human can list concepts and organize them into an interrelated whole. I ran a so-called indexing program on lectures 19 and 20 from volume 1, and the result is basically a concordance. Some of the terms don't quite make sense or not really something you'd want to look up. Near the bottom of the first column is "be nightmared long," which, what even is that? There are some good entries: cognition, cognitum, common sense, but Bell's handwriting, Eaton's TypeScript, that's just nuts. Here's what I came up with: a list of concepts, topics, and interrelated subtopics. As an example, I think you might want to look for the assigned essay topics, and there's the entry at the top of the third column. But that's a concept that can't be identified by an indexing program, whereas I can identify it blindly in my sleep. You can also see some interrelatedness with, for example, becoming and eternal and becoming, or with eternal versus endurance and endurance versus eternal. So how does a human indexer work? I read the book through once, either quickly or carefully, depending on how much time the publisher has given me to prepare the index. This first reading gives me an idea of the topics in the book and how they fit together. As I read, I think about what terms the reader is likely to look under. Most topics can be identified by several possible terms, which indexers call entry points. It's also important to think about what items should not be indexed, even if they look like good candidates. For example, the sentence, Julius Caesar must have felt this way as he stood on the banks of the Rubicon, contains no indexable material, even though it contains two proper nouns. Then I read through the book again, making the entries, sub-entries, and cross-references, and that's half the work done. Then I do the other half, alphabetize the entries and organize them. Organizing involves adding entries and sub-entries, consolidating entries and sub-entries, checking cross-references of page numbers, and formatting the index for the publisher. Just for fun, and because it's pertinent to the Whitehead lecture notes, let's look at how big an index is. A general book for a non-specialist audience has a shorter index because the material and the reader don't require a very granular list of interrelated concepts. The more technical the material and the more specialized the audience, though, the more fine-grained the index needs to be. You can get a good idea of the depth of the index by looking at the number of pages of index as a percentage of the number of pages of text. And this is the standard in publishing. How big is the index? So for example, a 200-page general book for non-specialist readers might have an index of 5 pages, whereas a 200-page technical book for specialist readers might have a 30-page index. The index for the second volume of Harvard lecture notes, if set in 2 columns and type a little smaller than the type used in the text, which is pretty standard, would run about 120 pages. The publisher made it fit into 68 pages by setting it in very small type in 3 columns, which crams about double the usual amount of index into a page. Give you another idea, the double-spaced manuscript that I submitted for volume 2 is 476 pages. The Harvard lecture notes are challenging in a number of ways. The nonfiction books have chapter titles and section headings and subheadings, which orients the reader and the indexer to the topics in a book. The Harvard lecture notes obviously have no such orientation. That makes it extremely hard for anyone to find anything. And the lectures themselves don't always follow a specific topic, even when Whitehead specifically states one. So you can't just find what you're looking for by glancing at the opening of a lecture. Whitehead uses common terms with his own meanings, like concrescence, event, ingression, occasion, prehension, transmutation. He also uses terms that evolve, so that a term he uses early in the year eventually gives way to a term he uses later in the year. The notes are not written out with standard grammar, and some terms are clearly miswritten by the note taker. So just figuring out what concepts the note taker is talking about and how they correlate can be challenging. As for non-indexable terms, it's normally pretty straightforward to see what's trivial or irrelevant, and therefore should not go in the index. But sometimes Whitehead uses an example that's important enough on its own that I thought I had better put it in. And in general, I err on the side of inclusion because I just want to make sure you can find what you need to, because who knows? Here are some examples. As for non-standard terminology, Whitehead is famous or notorious for using common English words in his own peculiar way. Concrescence is one. Events, ingression, occasion, so many occasions. Prehension, transmutation. You're familiar with even more of these than I am. So for example, for Whitehead, an event is a nexus of actual occasions. Well, that makes perfect sense in Whitehead's philosophy, but who besides Whitehead scholars would use that definition of event? For everyone else, an event is an activity or something that happens. Here's an example of Whiteheadian terminology. Superject and superjacent are Whitehead's terms that contrast to subject and subjacent. If you know some Latin, you have no problem understanding what they must mean. And in volume 1 on page 47, Whitehead explains, Pliny and Virgil use superjactio in this very sense, lying over. So there you go. But then in volume 2, Superject arises out of synthesis of its relationships: substance, circumstance, superstance. And on page 334, Paul Weiss writes, the superject is an ideal outside of everything and is really nothing. So now we've gone from perfectly obvious Latin cognates to a pair of perfectly Whiteheadian terms. Whitehead uses terms that are not standardized. Some terms evolve and even sometimes disappear. He tweaks his terminology and he introduces new terms in place of earlier ones: actual entity, actual occasion, imaginal occasion, experient occasion, and later what he will call the physical pole and mental pole of any occasion. The index, I hope, helps you track down these various occurrences so that by position and date, you can see the development of the later terms from the earlier ones. As for the task of indexing students' lecture notes, the notes are not written out with standard grammar, so it can be hard to figure out which concepts go where. And some terms are clearly miswritten by the note taker. For example, on Tuesday, March 1st, 1927, Conjure writes parts, when Whitehead scholars will understand he meant to write poles. This is clarified in the footnote, but without the clarification, I would be wondering how to index parts and how to correlate it with other concepts. And finally, for non-indexable terms, or more properly, terms that normally would not be considered indexable. In volume 1 on Saturday, November 1st, 1924, Whitehead is talking about procession. Very fundamental implication of simultaneity for Whitehead. Genuine modern relativists haven't this. A real sense of simultaneity between what's happening here and in Sirius or in London. Do I index Sirius or London? No, I do not. Sirius and London are examples that contain no information, and so I do not consider them indexable. On the other hand, in the first volume, Whitehead, when he's discussing control theory, uses the analogy of a boy catching a ball as shorthand for the concept of sense perception versus apprehension of the class of sense data. For example, catching the ball that stings hands. You need some control entity to define your class of sense data. It's the object exhibiting the color that interests you, not the display of sense data. And here's another one. What the schoolboy is emphatically not doing is classifying the phenomena, not anticipating sensations, et cetera, but it's thinking of the entity itself, the ball. So boy catching ball would not be indexable in another context, but this analogy is clearly an illustration Whitehead connects with control entity. For a start, it occurs 8 times in the lecture notes. And just as an aside, there's only one instance in Louise Heath's notes, either because she didn't write it down every time, or perhaps because it didn't seem to Whitehead like an analogy the ladies would appreciate. Anyway, because Whitehead consistently connects this illustration of boy catching ball with the concept control entity, it needs to be in the index. On the other hand, in the introduction, Paul Bogart is talking about Whitehead's lecture style, and he mentions Whitehead demonstrating a young boy catching a cricket ball. But because this is merely an illustration of a point Paul Bogart is making, and he's not connecting it with control theory, that one is not indexable. Finally, somewhere between these extremes is the boa constrictor in Paddington Station. In volume 2, at the end of the lecture for Thursday, October 7th, 1926, Conjure's note reads, most facts can't be fitted in. Always hope we could get them there if we had time and could get them there, but always something escapes. Boa constrictor in Paddington. Jackson's notes also have always facts which escape, the wild facts that can't be tamed. Wild boa constrictor got loose in London Station. Well, here's Whitehead referring to an event that had happened that Monday and was in newspapers all over the world on the Tuesday. Explorers were returning from Central America and had brought back, among other things, a variety of life forms, including some snakes, one of which was a boa constrictor. When the boat train arrived at Paddington, the guard who opened the door to their carriage saw their 18-foot boa constrictor, which had escaped its cage, which a wild fact that couldn't be tamed. But Lady Brown and Mr. Mitchell Hedges managed to wrestle the snake back into its cage, unlike Whitehead's wild facts. What a picture. Even though this example only occurs once, it's so evocative. I think it's pertinent to Whitehead's point and deserves an entry. Okay, so there it is. What an index is, how an index is written, what's challenging about indexing the Harvard lecture notes. Thank you.
What fun. I love that example. Thank you so much, Joan. What a great opportunity to discuss something that we don't necessarily always do. Before we turn to Paul, I just wanted to note your comments reminded me that one of the things that provoked me to want to explore the start of a critical edition was the inadequacy of the indices for the monographs. They're awful. They're almost worthless. The Harvard monographs are all, with the exception of the revision of the Process and Reality, are really bad. And so one of my long-term thoughts was, one of the values we could have is having more useful indices. But I wanted to pose a devil's advocate argument. In the digital age, you made I think, a persuasive argument that concordances aren't the same and aren't useful. But what would you say to someone who said, if we've got digital versions of these texts, these books, and I can just do a keyword search for anything I want, then an index, what if a publisher came to us and said, look, we don't need an index anymore because we're going to just give it to readers electronically, they can search through it. What would you say?
I would say, yes, you can search, but you have to know that you'll find the term. That's the first thing. The second thing is, if you don't have an index, how do you know what's in the book? So you have chapter headings, you have section headings, maybe you've read the book, maybe you're oriented and you have an idea of what you want to search. But suppose you've just picked up the book, or suppose it's the Whitehead lecture notes. How do you even know what's in there? I mean, how do you know to search for boa constrictor? So the index, you could just sit down and read through the index and say, oh, look, here's Julius Caesar, or, something you would not expect to find. I wonder what that's about. And then you can look. Whereas if you've read the book, or if you're really familiar with the topic, you have an idea what you want to look at. You can say control theory, and then you can find it. But you can find all the instances of that term control theory, but it's not necessarily going to give you every instance of discussion you want to find. So you might be looking under control theory and missing where he talks about control entity. But the index, if it's a good index, will have both of those terms in it. And then you'll be able to find everything.
I can tell you must read the index first in many books, which is not surprising. But let me bring Joe in and then Paul.
Yeah, I feel like I just need to pose this question to you again that I posed to you a few years ago in November 2020 when you were putting together the index for HL2. And because you also did the index for HL1, and based on just the automated word count of them, for HL1, it was about 24,000 words, while the index for HL2 is about 44,000 words, almost twice as long. And I thought I'd ask you again if you had any idea why it ended up so much longer. I wonder if maybe it was that the second volume was 2 years of lectures instead of just one, or maybe that HL1 contained multiple counts of the same lecture, which HL2 didn't really, unless you count Heath, or perhaps in the 4 years between, you got better at indexing Whitehead specifically. Any idea?
I think it's some of all of those things. So for example, in volume 1, you have more than one set of notes for a lecture. So if everybody has a note about control entity, then I have control entity with 3 page numbers. Where I have the same volume of material, but it's all different, then I might have 1 page number for control entity, and then other entries are taking up that space, if that makes sense. Also, yes, as I get familiar with the whole Whitehead note thing, I think I was getting better at it.
Thanks.
Paul.
Joan, let me say first how pleased I am to meet you, even if it's through this strange Zoom thing. I have no idea what time zone you're in. Secondly, let me say how disappointed I was to hear that I did not deserve to be in the index. and you outed me in public. So, or my reference to the catching the cricket ball. That was fun to hear. Thank you. As the lead editor for Volume 1, I must say, when I finished my job on that volume, I realized, number one, boy, did this thing need an index. And number two, I could not imagine how anyone could pull that off. So I'm not wearing a hat. If I did, it would be off to you. Many thanks for your work. I thought you did a splendid job. I think you make these lecture volumes usable, accessible as the tools they're meant to be. And we have you to thank for that. So thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Joan, I'm sorry to keep playing devil's advocate before I go to Landon, but so the National Endowment for the Humanities has increasingly in recent past been mostly interested in supporting for scholarly editions 100% digital projects. They're less interested now in, from what I can tell, in projects that are in print and in digital form, which is what ours is, as you know. So I've just been thinking a lot about the way that we publish things and the way we present material and how it affects the nature of the scholarship. And so I wanted to use this as an opportunity to invite you to sort of think with me a little bit about it, and everybody else is sort of, do you think that, so let's take the PERS project. As I understand it, it's a digital only project, and each of the items is in a database, and they're all able to be organized in whatever way you want electronically, but they're all just sort of, and we have some Persians here who can correct me if I'm wrong. I would think of them as more all on the same level. Mm-hmm. You've got items, right? Whereas when we set about, Joe and I and colleagues set about making a volume, we're thinking about creating an intellectual cohesion. We, for example, had to decide what to do with the fact that we had multiple instances of the same lecture. We have, Joe, how many? We would have five or six some at the most for some lectures. Is that right, Joe?
Yeah. As many as 5.
So as many as 5 note takers for one lecture at one time. And we had to invent it, and Joe invented a cool new method for how to capture what was different, which one was the best one, representing that, and then reflecting in the footnotes the things that were additional. But that was forced on us by the constraints of creating a volume, a physical volume. Which has an intellectual integrity to it. And so we had to do work and think about it in a way that we wouldn't have had to had we just presented all of them all electronically to the to scholars. And I think of indexes as the same way. It's sort of this question about, is that anachronistic? Is that just sort of going to go away especially in this area of scholarly editions and translations? And so I don't know if I have a question there or not. It's just sort of, how do we make the case for the additional intellectual value to scholars of the kind of work that you have done and are doing? How would you help us make that case to the NEH?
Again, I think it's the combination of how do you know what's in the book and how do you know what terms to search for? So there might be a way to type, this is just like Google search, right? You just type your term that you're searching for in the search pane. But how many times have we done that and we get hits that are completely different from what we're looking for? I think a list of terms that you would expect to find in the book, something you could run down and click on maybe, would take you to the point in the book where you would find the term or the concept. Whereas having to think of it yourself, you might think of something that I haven't thought of, or you might be using a term that connects to something you're not looking for. So having the list to work from, I think, is helpful.
Thank you. I'm going to keep pondering on this one. Our application will be due in a couple months, and we'll see if we can include some coherent explanation about what the index itself adds, because I think that's an interesting point. Let's bring in Landon, and then William.
Thanks a lot for your talk and really valuable work. I have to say that I've used the index quite a bit in writing this paper, even after I'd read the whole volume, because I wanted to look back for specific concepts. So the distinction between the index and the sort of atomistic listing of words was super useful. I have a question for what advice you give somebody who has to do similar work with another Whitehead text, which is Principia. And of course it's co-authored, but there's still jokes in it.
Right.
And there's allusions and stuff like that in it. There's jokes about monists when they talk about how many entities there are. There's jokes about, how many husbands are married to how many wives and vice versa.
Okay.
And there's all sorts of cultural allusions and sort of offhand jokes, even despite the fact the book is mostly written in symbols,
Right.
non-English symbols. So I'm just curious, what would you suggest for someone who's trying to undertake this work with another Whitehead book?
Oh, you need two things to do a good index. One is you have to place yourself in the position of the reader. What will the reader want to look for? And what are these concepts? And get that all organized. But the other thing is you have to understand the material. So in your case, in the case of the Principia, you have to know that there are jokes in there, and you have to know what they are. And you have to think of a way to be sure they show up in the index, even though they're not clear, they're not maybe readily apparent when you just look at the page. You have to read it and understand what you're reading. So I might not be the best indexer for Principia, but somebody who's a Whitehead scholar, especially in the early, math and logic days, would be better at it because they would get it. So yeah, you need those two things.
Yeah, thanks for that.
We've got time for one more. William, want to squeeze you in?
Thanks. It occurs to me, if we look at the index as a function to go along with data, then we're going to be well put, and we can ask the question, does it need to be in print or not? Or how would it be? If you go to the logical extreme of putting everything on the same level, then how do you know what you got in your bucket? You've got a topic, you've got a group. So there's an organicity. There's something organic about making to the material that you select that goes along with, that defines the community, that attracts the interest, that makes the material employable. Now, it may be you want to have a software frame, an index frame. You have the data and you push a button, the frame comes. But somebody, some blessed soul like yourself, still has to do the work to make that frame massage that data, and it won't know what to do with data from libertarian ranting or something. It wouldn't know what to do with that. So, but that distinction of index frame as an organic function, very essential to the project. Whether it exists in print or not could be an open question, but the function should happen.
Yes, I think that's right. And yes, even if it's not in print, you need access to that kind of, I'm not putting this right. You need a way to get into the book. You need a way to get to the topic you're looking for. You need a way to find the concept. So you need this index frame, as you say.
Thank you very much again, Joan. Let's all give a round of applause. Farzad, I'm sorry, we didn't quite have enough time. I don't want to shortchange our next speaker. Thank you both. Thank you so much, Joan. That was really, really fun. Love the conversations that you helped create.